it feels like an age since I've been with you, and I want to give a big shout out to Alexa Jett, who so capably sat in for me, and I just want all of you to hold her in your thoughts and hearts, because she's facing some health issues right now, which we hope won't be too serious. So we just want to keep praying that they won't be serious. So tonight we have with us someone who is an absolute chameleon, because she seems like she's done everything. I know that at some point she was close to me here in deep southern Arizona, up in Tucson, 40 minutes north at the U of A. So she's a wildcat, we know that. We know that she spent some time in the legal profession, although I'm not quite sure what she was doing there. And then she became a photographer. And then after the photographer, she became a ceramic artist. And somewhere along the line, she also managed to spend some time learning some healing arts. And that's where we join her right now with the healing arts. And I am truly happy to welcome Avesha Michael. Hello, Avesha.
Hi, Rick. Thanks for having me. Hi.
How are you?
I'm good.
I don't know if I got everything in. Was there anything I missed? Did you do anything else along the way that we didn't talk about? Maybe you were a waitress sometime.
I was actually. I studied acting for 2 years. Yeah.
You studied acting for 2 years. Yeah, I forgot that part, right? So, and you were at U of A. Did you ever get down to Tubac?
I did not. No, Nogales, but not Tubac.
Well, you passed through. If you got to Nogales, you passed through Tubac and then Rio Rico and then Nogales. So you didn't say hello.
I was in an altered state of mind at that time.
Okay. Okay. Now, look, I have been thinking a little bit about what we're going to talk about tonight. And didn't you start off your life and your world in Chicago, which is where you are now?
Yes. Yeah.
You did.
Yeah.
So I think it might be relevant to talk a little bit about you and your family in Chicago before you got down to the U of A. And maybe tell us what those pictures were that we saw right at the beginning.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Rick. So I was actually technically born in Petaluma in Northern California. But I grew up much of my childhood until I was 11 in Chicago. My dad remarried when I was 11 and we moved to Arizona. And then I keep coming back to Chicago. I came back to Chicago after college when I graduated U of A, and then I went to LA for 22 years. And now last year I moved back to Chicago. So it's always home in my heart. And regarding the photos, I don't remember the order, but I believe the middle one was a black and white of my dad and I. And that was, I believe that was a photo from an insight seminar, which I kind of grew up in. It was these personal developmental programs that are really kind of heart-centered in base. And so that was from a family insight seminar that my dad and I took together. And the last one was whole nother story that I've shared. But my dad took me backpacking for 8 days when I was 8 years old, actually, in the Rocky Mountains. So that's a whole nother story, but what a beautiful memory.
Wow.
Yeah.
So did you know that Petaluma is the home of the Jewish chicken farmers?
No, I love chickens. I did not know. Thank you for sharing.
Well, it is, and that's where all the Jewish chicken farmers came when they, not all of them, but a lot of them did. And there's a whole KQED PBS. I lived in Marin for many years. So I know Petaluma, Sonoma, but it's not
Wow.
very far. So that's another part of the world that we have in common
Yeah. No.
is
Wow.
Sonoma, Marin. So who else was in your family?
So my parents divorced when I was 5. I actually went with my dad. So, that's like a real base, is that I grew up with my dad. He raised me. I didn't really even live or connect with my mom in a real foundational way until after college, when I moved back to Chicago and
Hmm.
developed a relationship, really. Um, so I went with my dad after the divorce. My brother was 2 years younger than me. He went with my mom. They lived close by in Chicago. And then my dad remarried, and it became a big blended family: stepmom, stepbrother. And then my stepmom and my dad had a child, my sister. So that's the family makeup. They divorced though, like 30 years ago. So
Okay,
yeah.
so from that, so now we're up to 2 marriages for your dad and 3 kids. Am I right? Is
Well,
that right?
he was married before.
Almost.
He was married before my mom, so he had 3 marriages
Oh,
and 3 kids.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, three
3 and 3.
marriages and 3 kids. And if the audience is wondering why are we going there, it's because this is actually sort of relevant to the whole story overall, from what I
Yeah,
can gather, right?
it is.
Is that the case?
It is.
It is. So and your dad was in Arizona and lived in Arizona for the
Boy.
rest of his life, pretty
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. He stayed his whole life. Yeah. He loved it
And
there.
and you were raised after the age of 11. Where were you raised? Arizona?
We were in Scottsdale, Arizona. Yeah. That was
Oh,
a hard transition for me. Um, but yeah, we were in Scottsdale. It was such a culture shock in so many ways, from living in the city of Chicago. And
oh yeah.
yeah,
I get that. I
yeah,
get that. And Scottsdale, Phoenix and Tucson are really, really different, as you well know right
yeah,
now.
yeah.
Your dad should have moved to Tucson for you.
Oh,
You would have been a happier kid living in the Tucson
mm,
area, I think, than in the Phoenix area. But now all the Phoenix people are going to get on my case and say, But yeah, I mean, it's a whole nother ethos.
mm,
So you're going to tell us a story because that's what you do.
yeah,
And I'd love for you to introduce that story and then tell us the story.
sure. So, this first story that I'll be sharing is a time when my dad came to take care of me. I had meningitis, and I'll just jump right in if that's okay. So I think it'll explain a lot. So this past December, I woke up on a Sunday morning and I had this image in my head. It was before I even opened my eyes. I was still laying in bed and had this image of this photo that I had taken back in 2013. It was when I actually first joined Instagram, and it was a photo of this bright, colorful bowl of soup. I mean, it was this really beautiful vegetable soup. It was glistening and it was bursting with color. It had, cherry tomatoes and celery, zucchini. It even had some kale because I was living in LA at the time. And it was just this really beautiful, warm, golden broth. And even now, just thinking about it it feels nourishing, and it fills me with love because it was my father's love. My dad made me that bowl of soup. This really brought me, when I had this image in my head this last December, it really brought me back to May of 2013, because I had just gotten out of the hospital and I was released way too early. I had meningitis, viral, not bacterial. And I was in the ICU for about a week, but they let me out really early and I couldn't walk, I couldn't talk. I mean, I could hardly keep my eyes open because I was so sensitive to light and sound. The pain was so great that even my trusted down pillow, which I travel with, it just couldn't comfort me. It felt like this slab of concrete behind my head with just spikes piercing in. That's how bad the pain was. And I had been sick for many weeks before I even got in the hospital. And at this point, when I got home, I wasn't able to do anything, so I needed help desperately and immediately. And my mom back in Chicago told me that she was unable to come because she was going to lose her job and she needed that for her survival. And I understood that at the time, but she called my dad and asked him if he could come take care of me. Now, at that time, my dad and I were just kind of reconnecting because we had what was one of two estrangements that we had gone through. So this was our first estrangement, and we had in the repair phase, but we had just started talking again. So, you know, under the conditions, my dad was more than happy to come care for me. He jumped on it. He agreed to come care for me. And that was even knowing that he had debilitating sciatica. He had chronic pain every day, and he would be sleeping on my living room floor. I lived in this 1-bedroom apartment at the time, and I lived with my beloved cat Pasha at the time, who's now passed away, but she couldn't take care of me. So my dad showed up the next day, and he found me back in my bedroom in complete dark. I had like a wrap over my face, and the blinds were tight shut, and there was even like a sheet over the blinds because I was that sensitive to light. And I was so sensitive to sound that we had to find a way to communicate, my dad and I, because even the sound of a voice was too much for me. That's how extreme the pain was. So my dad ended up getting a notepad, and he had a chair next to my bed. And most, you know, throughout the day, he would just sit next to my bed and we'd pass a notepad back and forth and communicating. And the only thing that my dad really couldn't help me do was, you know, go to the bathroom. So when I had to go, I would roll off my bed and I would crawl on my hands and feet through the hallway to the bathroom. So it was a pretty grueling, traumatic experience having meningitis. But I remember one day, this one particular day, you know, I was in bed and my apartment was really small, so sound would travel. And my dad was in the kitchen. He told me he was making a vegetable soup, all organic, because that was important to me. And it was that soup in the photo that I woke up in December, remembering that image on Instagram. My dad was in the kitchen and he was singing. He was singing and humming how he always did growing up, because my dad was a musician my entire life. That was his absolute love. Now, when I was a child, I have to say, like, in truth, when my dad would sing, he's an amazing pianist, like an incredible musician. But when he sang, I would kind of cringe as a child. But in this moment, as I was laying in bed, it was so comforting for me. Just hearing him sing while he chopped the vegetables. It was as if every vegetable he chopped that I could hear, he was like infusing love in every single chop he made. And I just felt like it was almost as if he thought, if he could put all the love he ever had for his firstborn, which is me, you know, back in that bed, you know, in so much pain, if he could just put all the love he ever had for me, that he could help me heal. That's how it felt. And it was just really joyful hearing him from bed. I remember that deeply. And there was a moment while he was doing that, that he kind of yelled out quietly to me. He said, you know, I'm going to clean your entire kitchen. He used the word filthy, but he said it's filthy. I'm going to clean under the produce stores, in the cupboards, under the sink, and he did just that. He meticulously cleaned my entire kitchen over the next few days. So that night when he finished the soup, he brought the bowl in bed to me. He took the cover off my eyes and he helped roll me over to my left side. And when I saw that soup, it was like the most vibrant, it was just the most vibrant, life-giving meal I'd ever seen in that moment. And I don't know if it was all the care and tenderness that my dad put into it, but I swear to this day that it helped me walk again. I just have felt that ever since. Now, about a week after that, my dad begged me, because I was hesitant, to just help me downstairs. I lived on a second floor of an apartment complex, kind of like the old Melrose, where the courtyard is in the middle. And I was super weak. I had atrophied a lot. But my dad helped me outside. And this was like the first time I had fresh air in like a month. And just to breathe the air and to feel the sunlight on my face was like absolutely exquisite. And to remember what it felt like to put your bare feet in the grass. It was just bringing all my senses alive again. And it really reminded me that it truly is the littlest things that just spark immense reverence for life. So he helped me upstairs. I couldn't stay long because I was really weak, as I mentioned. And shortly after that experience, my dad ended up having to leave again, and go back home to Arizona. And I was on my own to take care of myself, and I was still healing. And right after he went to the airport, my neighbor, Brian, who is a dear friend of mine, took my dad to the airport. And I went to make myself a cup of tea, just kind of in his absence, wanted some comfort. And I opened the cupboard to get my favorite mug that I made because I do pottery and did back then. And I reached for the mug in the cupboard and it wasn't there. And that's when I realized, like, despite all the care and how you organize things, none of it made sense. Like, the vitamins were next to the bowls and the cat food was next to my plates. Like, the thing was, it was a little bit of chaos and organization, but what really stuck with me was all the love he shared in detailing my kitchen, to the point where I didn't touch those cupboards for 9 years. It wasn't until I had to move last year in April from LA to Chicago that I actually packed everything up. I left the cupboards how they were for 9 years. It just reminded me of how my dad wholeheartedly cared for me so much at that time. And I remember taking my mug and I went to the couch in my living room and I sat down and I looked across the room at where my dad had slept on the floor on the carpet in front of my bookcase. He had been propped up on pillows to help his pain, and it was empty. And I remember taking a photo for Instagram because it was new for me. And I captioned it really simply. It just said, my dad was here and now he's gone and it's a little lonely. I miss him. And today, if I could, I would call him or email him or write him and let him know just how much his unending, like, selfless love meant to me during that time. I would. But I can't, because my father did die last year unexpectedly. And I can't even express how much I would give to hear him singing joyfully right now. It was really only in my dad's passing that I truly, truly, like, at a deep level, really let it sink in how unbelievably unconditional my father's love was and is for me. I mean, he would have crossed the entire world to care for me. And I know that in the core of my being. And I would give anything for a bowl of his soup right now. I mean, just thinking about it really, it fills me with a lot of love. Thank you.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts. First thing is, did your dad leave any frozen soup for you in the
Oh
ice box?
my God.
Was there any soup later on that you could eat?
No, I don't remember that. I mean, it was a traumatic time for me, but I don't think so. I think I just gobbled it up. I think it helped me get well.
Okay. Okay. And I'm also curious whether your dad was still around when you moved to Chicago, or did he die before you moved to Chicago?
So we became estranged again some years ago. And so we were estranged, which is kind of the core of the hard, if it can be harder to lose a parent, but I think the hardest part was that we were estranged when he passed. So I moved to Chicago last year in April. The interesting thing, Rick, is I actually had, like, I don't know what you want to call it, an intuition, but before I moved, about 3 weeks before I moved to Chicago last year, I had this gut kind of knowing or sense of, like, the fear of leaving the proximity of Arizona for not having that opportunity to reconnect. So no, we were estranged and I moved to Chicago not having completed with him.
But you see, you weren't really estranged because he was always in the kitchen closet.
That's true. I mean, that's so true.
That's the point. Because you never touched what was in the kitchen closet, in those cupboards. You didn't touch it, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Which says to me that your dad was always with you in the form that you wanted him to be in the kitchen. What do you think about that?
I like that idea.
Avesha?
I like that.
You like that, huh?
I do.
I'm just thinking, let's go back to this meningitis a little bit. So you said they shouldn't have let you out so quickly. What exactly is meningitis?
So to the best of my memory now, it's like
Yeah.
when the fluids around your brain tissues and your spinal cord get inflamed is my best recollection. So it's the inflammation. And it can come in two forms. I had viral. If I had bacterial, I might honestly not be here today, but I had viral,
Right.
so I'm here, which I'm grateful for.
Right.
But it was a pretty traumatic. It was overwhelmingly terrifying, and took me at least a month to be able to get out of bed, and
Wow.
yeah, yeah.
So since you've been, by the time you got meningitis, you were much involved in the arts because you were a photographer at that point, right?
I was, yes, actually, I was actually mentoring for this amazing photographer. I worked with them for years, but I was also doing photography myself. So yeah, listen, Rick, I grew up, my dad, the one thing he loved that influenced and supported from the beginning was the arts.
Was the
So
arts.
yeah.
And what was your involvement in the arts as a child and growing up and during the period that you were involved in? I don't know what you did. Were you a lawyer? Were you a paralegal? What were you?
I was a paralegal. I did not go to law school. I was supposed to, and that's a whole different story that I can share another time. But
We're not going there.
I didn't practice law. I recruited and did HR for attorneys for like almost a decade. So I worked in-house for large law firms.
Right.
Growing up, to kind of answer your question about the arts, my dad was actually a musician, like in the early 80s in Chicago. He was in bands. I remember when I was 8, my bedroom was next to the second bedroom, and that was his music studio. It had like a metal gate on it, like it was a full-fledged music studio. But I remember also so many times, I still have some of the books. We would just sit out on these big blank books, and we would just each have a page, and we would just draw. Like I don't say this lightly, he could not stop creating. It didn't matter the medium. It was like creating art was literally the foundation of my entire upbringing. And so I actually took my first pottery class when I was 8 and left it on and off. I always found my way back, but if I can share with you an experience I had when I was in bed during this period that my dad, in this story I just shared, when I was in bed, I actually had kind of a cliche moment, but it was real. I had this epiphany and I remember hearing a question in my head, asking myself, what would I regret if I didn't make it? Because at that point, you're so sick, you don't really know how things are going to go. And the answer immediately that came to me was, I would regret not giving pottery a go, because I was teaching almost full time at a studio, helping manage it, and in West Hollywood. And I didn't have a way to meet this early demand as I started to dabble in selling things. And so that was kind of the hidden blessing that came out of this really horrific traumatic experience of meningitis. I ended up making a decision as soon as I could get strong enough to get out of bed. I remember driving to West Hollywood and buying my first baby kiln. And I put my bed in the living room, and I literally turned my bedroom into a makeshift pottery studio. So that came out of that really awful experience.
So that's one answer to the next question I had for you, which was how the arts helped you heal. I mean, one way they helped you heal from the meningitis was to plunge into pottery full time, right?
Absolutely. I think it gave me, I always say this, I don't know, clay itself, like the medium, is just so much a part of me. It's just in me somehow. And so I always needed to connect with it. And I think after I had that moment laying in bed, that motivation towards moving in the direction full time of creating and doing art, like doing the thing I loved since I was 8, I think to answer what you're saying, I think it helped me heal. I think it gave me the motivation to take that next big leap. Yeah.
Well, we'll talk more about pottery and what you're doing now. And And we'll talk a little bit about this this estrangement, because I can relate to that, as we've shared. But why don't you introduce the next segment, which is sort of a double segment, right?
Yeah, yes, and I'll share just in brief why. Thanks, Rick. So I'm going to read a short poem that will actually kind of lead into my second and last story that I want to share. So the day that I got the news that my dad died, I was in complete shock, totally out of body, but I had this last acupuncture appointment downtown Chicago, and I got on the red line, and I just was committed to going. So it was like 2 hours after I got the news, and I remember laying down on the table, and my acupuncturist went to get the needles. And so this poem is of that experience as she was out of the room and I was laying there alone waiting for her to come back with the needles. So the poem is called Ocean of Forgiveness. Ask me about love, and I'll tell you of the table, how she greeted me and then went for the needles. I lay on the surface, voices in the distance, and without warning, an ocean came over me, waves surfacing and washing over me from head to feet, no time to ask, where are the needles? A movie was playing just for me. Lessons kept coming, so massive and fleeting. A healing hard to fathom altered my existence. My dad as a boy, I was feeling his wounding. My heart melted as I lay on that table. Tears trickled down my face, estuaries as the ocean gave way. You hear of tales of forgiveness, but you buff them off with resistance. Yet as I lay there immersed in a gift that day, all I wanted to do was reach out and hug him. That I craved. I'm even bold enough to call it a miracle healing, because the hurt and the harm disappeared in moments like days, floated away with the waves, wrapped in compassion, engulfed in love. My arms were around his legs like when I was 7 or 8. And this poem that I just shared was a truly transformative experience. And the real beauty of having that healing of all the hurt and harm that led to our estrangement just kind of dissolving, it allowed me to do what I had to do, which is this next story that I'm going to share with you. It allowed me to step into the role of being high functioning and showing up for my dad after he passed and handling all his completion, but from a place of deep honor and love. So I will share the next story. When my brother and I arrived in Phoenix, Arizona, it was last August, and it was extremely hot out. It was 110 degrees, and you could see the heat on the asphalt in the distance. And we were both still in complete shock. Yet we had a really massive job to do, and we had 5 days to do it. So we got in our rental car, and I drove us to Mesa, Arizona, and we found lot 271. It was in a Mobile Park Citrus Gardens, which was an elderly mobile park home community. And we found our father's mobile home, which was a 1965 single wide mobile home. And it had on front the word okie dokie. We parked our car, and we noticed that there was a fallen cactus in front, just laying over, looking really tired, kind of meeting the mood of the moment. And yet my brother and I could not go in my dad's mobile home yet. First, we had to put on our hazmat suits that I bought off of Amazon. We had to put on our medical booties. We had to put on our respirator masks, the big ones like I use when I do pottery, our goggles, and our gloves. You see, our father had died unexpectedly, and he had also died unattended, which is what the medical examiner used the terminology for. He was alone. And we had gotten the call a few weeks prior to this trip, but we were told that the police, it took them weeks to find next of kin. And the worst part was, because my dad was alone, he was found in the bathroom, and he was slumped over rather like that cactus in the front of his home. And it was peak Arizona heat, like I mentioned. So what this meant is that the decomposition sped up really quickly. And his single wide mobile home needed biohazard cleaning. I had never heard that word before, but it was extremely expensive. What I found out, that I hope no one has to find out when it's your parent or a close family member, but when a body decomposes, it leaves a scene that you don't ever want to see, and it leaves a smell, a stench that I was told if you smell it, you will never forget it. So we didn't have the money, my brother and I. We were both unemployed at the time, and we did a GoFundMe in the meantime, but we had to go and handle this all ourselves. So while we started the GoFundMe, we had 5 days to clear out my dad's home. And we did have a sister, our half sister, that lived about 20 minutes from our dad, but devastatingly enough, about 2 days after we all got the news, she completely tapped out, and it was up to my brother and I. So my brother and I, as much as we tried to prepare ourselves, we would never be prepared for what we entered and walked into. What we found was a cluttered mess, and the front room when we first walked in was recessed, and my dad had debilitating sciatica for decades. And so it became really evident very quickly. There was boxes and boxes of food that were never opened. And it just became instantly clear that my dad was not able to access anything that he needed in there. In truth, it was simply heartbreaking, even in that first moment, just to start putting these pieces together. I was advised before we went by my uncle, who's a doctor. He said, if you do one thing, the first thing you do when you enter his home is you close the bathroom door immediately and you don't look in. My therapist also was adamant about that, because I had been through a tremendous amount of trauma in leading up to this moment in time. And she didn't want me to be further traumatized. So my brother closed the door. We found our way to the kitchen. It was stifling hot. It was just a dungeon of darkness in my dad's place. All the doors were closed, the windows were shut, and it had a stench from hell, even with the door closed. And as we went through this initial process, we had so many questions that surfaced and consumed us, but we had so few answers because the police gave us almost nothing. The report from the medical examiner wasn't done, and his neighbors gave us what they could, but it wasn't enough. What we saw, though, and what we pieced together, our dad lived disabled, as I mentioned, for so long, but we found out after this trip that my dad had a plethora of health complications, serious health complications, especially in the months before he passed. The thing about my dad, though, is that my dad was a naturalist, like since I was born. He was just such a purist and very holistic by nature. So, we grew up with no chocolate, no sugar. It was all honey and carob, and it was extreme health in a way. But when you walked in his kitchen, it just became clear that my dad, he just really wanted to transition on his own terms, which I can only have to respect and honor. In the kitchen, we found this clock, and it was in the midst of this real heavy experience. Obviously, it actually made me smile because the clock had this label that said "now" on it right in the middle. And that really just touched me, because my dad was a lifelong meditator, and he would always say, all we have is now. He would always say that. So I think what it was referencing is like every second, no matter where you are on the clock in time, now, it's all now. We also found just a wall of Post-it notes along the kitchen wall, and that made me smile as well, oddly, because growing up, he was just obsessed with Post-it notes. And I am so my father's daughter, because I keep them all over my kitchen counter still. And the thing was, under the kitchen table, under those Post-it notes, there were 3 bags. They had each of his children's name on it. And in that moment, it became really clear that my dad knew that he was going to be passing at some point soon, and he was preparing. That became very evident to my brother and I. I found a mug in the cupboard that I had made him some years back, and the mug said, "Just this breath." And finding that mug was really dear to me, because when things would get really stressful, he would always remind me, the closest thing you have is your breath. That's the closest tool and resource you have in this life. There was actually a beautiful experience that my dad and my brother and I would, for many years, it was kind of like the oddest family reunion, because it was a silent meditation retreat, and the 3 of us would go once a year, and no talking, no eye contact. But I have memories still of, and this was in Prescott, Arizona. I have memories still of seeing his incredibly warm smile, just passing in the hallway during these retreats in silence. And I could feel palpable, it stays with me even today. It was palpable, the joy that supporting this practice in my brother and I gave him. It was exquisite. Now, there were some really hard moments during this trip. I'd say one of the absolute hardest moments was I was walking towards his bedroom, and it was a really windy day, and I had turned my head to the right to the bathroom. Unknowingly, the door had blown open because of the wind. And what I can say is that it looked like a crime scene. There's no other way to put it. It was the most atrocious scene I had ever seen in my life, in real time. It looked like what you watch in a movie or a TV show. It was truly horrific. And I ran out the back door, and I ran into his gravel where the orange tree was, and I puked under his orange tree because it just disturbed me that deeply. I'd say that the other really hard thing was about day 3 or 4, we split up, and my brother took the front room and I took my dad's bedroom. We had a few days left to complete everything. And as I walked into my father's bedroom, I would say that that moment, unfortunately, still haunts me today, because what I found was a twin, like a metal framed cot, like with springs, and there was no mattress in sight. There was just broken down cardboard boxes with some really raggedy old pillows kind of to the front of it. And standing there, I can remember standing there in the doorway, seeing this, and my entire heart just shattered. It just shattered to the floor. It was devastating. Because I think in that moment, it became crystal clear, and it's a much deeper story, but my dad needed help. He needed support, and he didn't have it. And there's a lot of systems that failed. But in that moment, it was just too much for me to bear. And yet I had to buckle down. We had to keep going because my brother was starting a new job, and we had to finish in 2 days. So we boxed up everything. My brother and I split between the 3 children, different respective photos and artwork that we all drew as kids together with my dad, and writings. My dad was an incredible writer. So many things we found of his writings. And we actually found his keyboard, which was his probably most treasured love in this world, was the piano. It was on his dining room table. We ended up gifting it to his neighbor, Michael, who we found out was a good friend of his. And Michael helped us gut my dad's entire home that day. Just such an angel. We also had some support because our sister was out of the picture. My dad's best and dearest friend, Carmen, and her son-in-law, Ryan, also helped us in various capacities. So we were really grateful for the support we did get, my brother and I. But while it was truly, like, without question, one of the most harrowing weeks of my entire life, what was kind of amazing and shocking was because my brother and I chose to fly across the country and show up out of love, out of honor, just to complete things for our dad, it ended up being the most amazing bonding experience for my brother and I. I mean, we still talk about it today. It still comes up in conversations how much we loved that time together, even though it was truly one of the most gut-wrenching weeks of our life. We just passed the year mark in August, and lately I love, especially as we met that year mark, which was pretty hard for me, the grief was pretty intense. I have things of my dad's that I brought back, shipped back. In almost every room I have his Buddha head in my herb garden, and I have pictures on my fridge of artwork that we drew together as when I was a child. And one of my favorite things that we found this box of instruments in my dad's bedroom. I found my recorder from when I went to Waldorf when I was young in Chicago, which I thought I lost my whole life. And there was a xylophone. There was 2, and my brother and I each took one. And I still play. It's been like a ritual, part of a grief ritual in some ways. At like midnight or right before I go to bed, I am in my garden room, this little room, and I play the xylophone every night. And I swear it's like my father's playing with me. It just feels more nights than not, just like it did when we used to play when I was a kid. Thank you.
So, um, I don't know where to start. Well, with an easy question. Are you do you love the vibraphone? Is that
The xylophone?
well, I'm going from the xylophone to the vibraphone. I mean,
Oh,
I'm a big fan of, I'm a big jazz fan,
oh,
and
oh,
my favorite artist is Milt Jackson, and playing the vibes. So I was thinking that's not a big stretch from, and I just wonder if you listen to any other vibraphone artists.
oh, but now, I have to be honest and admit right now, I did not know what a vibraphone is, but now you're bringing me to the instrument that I love. I love that sound. And I never knew to be honest, I never knew the name. So thank you for that, Rick. Thank you.
Okay, okay. Oh, and I think this picture that we're seeing is the Prescott area, right?
This was, and I wasn't supposed to be taking photos, so don't tell Howard Cohn from,
I won't, I won't, I won't.
but being a photographer, I couldn't help it. But this was the valley, Prescott Valley, where this Tibetan temple was that we would go for these retreats.
Right,
Uh, there's
right.
so much
We,
peace.
yeah, we found, Avesha and I found another common thread, which is that I attended Spirit Rock for many years and heard many speakers, including Howie Cohn. And I think he was your guru at
He was
this.
he was our teacher. Absolutely. I informed the community, actually, the Prescott community, when my dad passed. He was a very committed meditator, mindfulness meditation particularly, but
Mhm,
yeah, Howie was our teacher.
mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. Yeah. Well, like I said to you yesterday, I mean, I did hear Howie Cohn on Monday nights from time to time, because that's what happened at Spirit Rock. And maybe one of these days you'll find yourself at Spirit Rock, and you'll be very welcome, and you'll and you'll find the right place. I want to I want to I want to ask you how you came to terms with the period of estrangement
Yeah.
that ran into the time when your dad died.
Yeah.
So you were still estranged when your dad died. And
Yeah.
then you find out that you've lost your father, you were estranged at the time, and in a situation where you have to close out the estrangement, because that's really what you're doing when you're going back in. Tell me about that. I mean, that's
The estranged, a little bit about the
difficult
estrangement.
and intriguing, and I don't know what to call it, but so many things going on.
Yes, really. I think, if I can just say, and I will do my best to answer your question, like, I think for me, I've been unraveling this a little bit still. To me, that, the death of a parent, or anyone that close, particularly, is one of the greatest traumas you can go through, and the deepest levels of grief. But it's almost like a double whammy for me. It has been like a double whammy for me, because the pain of having to live with, not having been able to complete with my father, uh,
Yeah.
is so deep that it honestly, I was thinking the other day, it's a graphic thing, but it feels like, a bomb went off in, like, my solar plexus. That's how the pain feels sometimes. It's so immense. I think that was what consumed me the first days, if I'm really honest, was having to even hold that feeling of knowing, because you can't take it back. It's so cliche, everything you hear, but yeah. Can you help me out? I get, it's obviously a sensitive topic for me, but I would say that, like, if I could admit one thing, I think it's only been very recently, since the 1-year anniversary last month, that I've been really holding this and looking at this and being curious about it myself, because I think there's so many ways I could go about this, but I think that life gets busy, and I think it's easier to not revisit something like that separation, and the separation was on my behalf. So I think that I'm like, only now, if I'm speaking present time, I don't ever want to live with regrets, but I think if I could have done something differently, I wish I had. There's a phrase I grew up with, which is like, you do the best you know with what you're given at the time. And I do believe that in my core. However, I wish that I would have had the capacity to revisit a healing with my dad sooner, to find a way to create the safety within me, to have boundaries, honor, all the things that led to it. But I can't change that. And I wouldn't wish, holding what I'm holding on, I wouldn't wish it on anybody. It's a deep pain, if I'm really honest.
Do you feel that that at this point that your relationship with your dad has healed, and that both of you are in the same space now?
I love that question, Rick. I will try and answer that twofold. One,
Yeah.
that poem I read, Ocean of Forgiveness, I have a whole story I wrote on this, because I've never had like existential esoteric, I've never had an experience like that in my life. And it wasn't a temporary, it truly, all the resentment, all the harm, all the things that led to my being so deeply hurt and feeling so unsafe, that led to the estrangement, literally just melted. And I am so grateful. And I just blanked out because I went so focused on that. What was the question?
Well, do you feel you're no longer estranged from your dad? I mean, you were estranged from your dad when he died, and then you had to go in and you had to clean everything out and do all these things. Where is that estrangement today?
Yeah, it's really kind of amazing, Rick, because and I'm not just saying this, and maybe it wouldn't be true for everyone, but part of, I get a little choked up thinking about this. I had some profound experiences, after his passing. I will go specifically into one instance. All my dad's passwords had to do with my information, my name. I mean, this was such a kind of punch to the gut. I share that because it reflects how close my dad and I were. I mean, I was daddy's little girl. And just because we were estranged did not in any way diminish the immense and deep love that we had for each other. None of that was gone. And so the really wild thing that some people might not understand, but is true for me, is that in a weird way, my dad was fully human and plenty of flaws, as beautiful and incredible as he was and is. But in some ways, we have a stronger connection in the after. I don't even know how to express it fully, but I think part of it is that I really sunk into and accepted and realized, like, my goodness, I am so my father's daughter. I was his firstborn, and he loved me so immensely. Like, he was the one person in my life that completely unconditionally supported every single thing I ever did, wholeheartedly. And so our relationship, it's different. Obviously, I can't connect with him and hug him or be with him physically, but I don't want to say it's stronger, but like, it's pretty exquisite. And I don't want to go too much more into that, but it's rich. It's really rich. Yeah.
It's good to hear that. I mean, it's easy for me to relate to this because I had a long period of estrangement with my mother, and for the last 3 years of her life, I wouldn't say I was totally estranged, but it was very remote. And she died. She actually died when I was on the airplane going back, because I knew she was very sick. Yeah. So it's just there are some commonalities which I'm able to understand and to empathize with, but the situations are very, very different. I want to return back to a couple of topics, because there is a question in the chat that I know you would love to answer,
Okay.
which is, and it comes from one of your dad's band members.
Oh my, okay, that's awesome.
Yes, you did a good job getting the word out, Avesha. And tell us a little bit about the music that your dad made, and also you were in India with your dad, right?
Yeah, so I just actually found out recently from my mom that so I lived in India. My dad and my mom took us, we traveled all around the world, but we lived in India for a year. My dad was basically studying music. I just found out, I didn't know that piece. He was studying music and he was studying yoga and meditation. So music was it. It was it for my dad. And I mentioned that, the room next to my bedroom when I was 8 was a full recording studio. But I remember some of the most tender memories for me. I have a poem I wrote about this alone, but when I was little and even 5 and 6, I just have so many deep memories of sitting under my dad's grand piano and just I felt like I was his favorite fan. It was just incredible to have these really visceral, deep soul experiences. So yeah, music was it. And
What sort of music
the
did your
piano,
dad play?
the piano.
I mean,
My
yeah, but
dad,
was it
yeah,
folk music? Was it Indian music? Was it?
he
We had
did.
a lot of Beatles in that. There was a lot of Beatles in your
I know.
before. What was it? What was it that your dad played?
So my dad he played the keyboards, was his predominance. The piano, the keyboards. I have to say, I just want to say one thing about the Beatles. The reason those were there was because when I was after my parents divorced in Chicago, he had a orange VW bus. And I remember so vividly on Sunday mornings, they would play the Beatles. And I have really strong memories of sitting in the orange VW as we'd ride around listening to the Beatles. So that's always with me. But yeah, my dad played the keyboards, and he, while we're talking about music, but one thing I don't think it really sank in until I was talking to, say, a few of his old bandmates. I reconnected with a few people that were really dear to him after he passed. And I just all together, my dad was like a creative genius in some ways. So he had to create. He just, he couldn't stop in any mediums. So yeah, music was a huge influence.
I'm going to, because we're coming towards the end, and I just want to come back to what you're doing now and your pottery, because you have a pottery studio. So how has your father influenced the pottery that you're making? And tell us where we can find that pottery, because I got a few people who want to know where to see and where to buy the pottery.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. So I do mostly functional wear. I will say one thing in reference to my dad. So after that experience, when he came to care for me with meningitis, and I had that real epiphany of what I would regret doing, I did a Kickstarter. I raised the funds to get my first little studio. And I remember being in Arizona before one of the meditation retreats. This is just coming to me. And I was sitting at my dad's computer for hours, and he helped me come up with a name that I gave my studio, which was Uncommon Clay. That was my dad. He was involved in everything creatively I ever did. So pottery I sell on Etsy. So I'm not in a high production like I was back in LA for 8 years, but I am still creating. Can I share a piece that
you made? Or
so,
2 pieces even.
Yeah, so I have a few things here. I want to share one thing that's really interesting. I mean,
Yes.
I make everything. I have a candle lit here right now, and the beautiful thing about a candle is it can turn into a cup. It's just soy wax, so you can have a cup afterwards. The wild thing I just found was this bowl was the bowl that my dad actually served me the soup in. And I thought about that tonight. I made this when I was a teenager at Lil Street here, which is where I first started. And that's the blast of the bowl, but I had to share that because it's so meaningful. And then I think the last thing I'll share, so I make everything from mugs and, match strikers, spoon rests, all the functional things. But recently, due to a pretty serious back injury this past year, that had me in bed for 3 months this last winter. And I don't plan on repeating that, but I had to get off the wheel, and I started making, I love to garden now. So I started making these little gnomes. And I don't know, I cherished the whole experience of reconnecting with clay. And so these are for sale. They're kind of a great gift for, I've heard from many people that I know that they're a huge thing during the holidays in like Scandinavian and European.
Well, there you go. Do they have names? Do you engrave little names in each on the bottom? Can we find a name for?
Funny that you ask, Rick. That was a huge part of this for me. I'd have to pull it up on my phone, but in my notes, I actually named. In fact, I think this might be Faye. I named them each a different name, and I tried to like sparse them country to country. Anyways, I did get involved in naming them.
I would think nothing less. I would assume absolutely nothing less.
I love that.
Anyway, listen, guess what? The time is up. As I told you, it would fly by. So I want to thank you, especially for sharing these really deep, intense, heartfelt stories with us, and for being so open. And of course, I want to thank my wonderful producer, John Ivory, and our director, Brianna. And we should say that you came to us through John Ivory because you're in a writing group together, I believe.
A storytelling community.
Storytelling community together. Of course, as always, audience, please don't forget the tip jar for the marsh. And next month, I think we have another storyteller who is a doctor and a PhD by the name of Sam Blackman, but I don't know any more than that. So that's all I have, and I'll be back next month with Dr. Blackman. So we'll see you then.